The Russian Defense Ministry recently confirmed that 600,000 Russian soldiers were wounded, marking the highest military casualty figure Russia has admitted since World War II. This unprecedented admission reflects the massive scale of Russian losses in Ukraine, far exceeding previous unofficial estimates by international observers. Military experts say that this figure reflects not only the brutality of the conflict but also the far-reaching impact on Russia's military capabilities. Human cost analysis. Recent analysis has revealed the staggering human cost of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, with September 2024 being marked as the deadliest month of the conflict. The total number of Russian casualties has now reached an unprecedented 615,000, including 115,000 killed and 500,000 wounded. This staggering toll highlights the immense scale of losses Russia has suffered during the ongoing war. The sheer magnitude of these casualties has created serious demographic challenges for Russia's military capabilities. To compensate for the battlefield losses, Russian forces have been recruiting between 25,000 to 30,000 new soldiers every month. At the peak of intense operations, the casualty rate soared to more than 1,200 personnel per day. The country has faced particular difficulties in maintaining an adequate fighting force, especially as it seeks to avoid mass mobilization while replenishing its ranks. These demographic pressures are felt across Russian society, with the military increasingly relying on older volunteers and former prisoners to sustain operations. Geographically, the casualties are distributed unevenly across Russia's regions, with the highest losses concentrated in economically disadvantaged areas. Bashkortostan and Tatarstan have each seen approximately 2,000 confirmed deaths, while the Ural regions have also sustained substantial losses. Many of these casualties come from smaller towns where stable, well-paid work is scarce, making military service an increasingly viable option for young men in these areas. The study also revealed the involvement of foreign fighters, with 272 casualties from countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. As the conflict has dragged on, the age profile of casualties has shifted significantly. Initially, most of the casualties were young professional soldiers aged 21 to 23. However, the typical casualty today is much older, with the majority of volunteer soldiers being between 42 and 50 years old. This age group has suffered around 4,100 deaths. Additionally, 250 volunteers above the age of 60 have died, with the oldest casualty reported to be 71 years old. The 35 to 39 age group has experienced particularly heavy losses, with up to 27,000 fatalities. This shift in the age demographics reflects Russia's growing reliance on older volunteers and recruited prisoners to sustain its military operations. The profound implications of these changes are not limited to Russia's military, they extend to its broader social structure. With approximately 2% of all Russian men between the ages of 20 and 50 either killed or severely wounded in Ukraine, these losses will have lasting effects on the country's population and its future military capabilities. Social impact in Russia. These demographic shifts are already sparking profound social transformations within Russian society. In response to the high number of casualties, the government has rolled out substantial financial support measures for the families of deceased and injured soldiers. Families of fallen soldiers receive federal aid of 5 million rubles, around USD 68,800, while injured soldiers are entitled to 3 million rubles, USD 41,300. Despite these provisions, many of those affected face significant bureaucratic delays in receiving their compensation, adding to the frustration and hardship felt by the grieving families. This complex social challenge underscores the broader, long-term implications of the war, with consequences rippling across Russia's population, military, and overall societal stability. To assist affected families, the Russian government has established a multi-tiered compensation structure. In addition to federal aid, regional governments offer supplementary payments ranging from 1 to 3 million rubles, bringing the total possible compensation for a soldier's death to 14 million rubles. The government also guarantees university education for the children of fallen soldiers, while spouses receive ongoing support payments. Despite these provisions, many families report experiencing delays and bureaucratic hurdles in accessing these benefits, further complicating their already difficult circumstances. Communities across Russia have had to adapt to the growing presence of wounded veterans and grieving families. Local initiatives include the installation of memorial plaques in schools and public buildings, the creation of dedicated veteran support centers in federal districts, and community-based rehabilitation programs. Despite these efforts, the healthcare system is struggling to meet the needs of returning soldiers. The country has only 10 veterans hospitals nationwide, with just 32 psychiatric rehabilitation beds available, far from adequate to address the scale of the crisis. Public sentiment regarding the conflict remains complex and evolving. While official support for military operations remains high, there is growing concern over the mounting casualties. Research indicates a shift in public opinion, with many citizens increasingly worried about the human cost of the war. The Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation, established in June 2023, allocates just 3% of its budget to psychological treatment, highlighting the limited institutional response to veterans' mental health needs. Regional economic patterns also reflect the social impact of the war. In some areas heavily affected by casualties, bank deposits have surged by 151% since January 2022, particularly in poorer regions where military service has become an economic lifeline. In Buryatia, a region severely impacted by casualties, residential construction has increased by 32%, far surpassing the national average of 2%. The social fabric of Russian society continues to adapt to these unprecedented circumstances. Some communities are experiencing what sociologists term learned difference, as the constant loss of life becomes a grim, yet accepted part of daily life. Despite the mounting casualties, the government's extensive financial support system has helped maintain social stability. However, long-term challenges in veteran care and community reintegration remain significant concerns, and the true impact of the conflict on Russian society will likely be felt for many years to come. Military healthcare crisis. At the heart of this struggle lies the military healthcare crisis. The unprecedented scale of Russian military casualties has overwhelmed the country's medical infrastructure, pushing it to the brink. Recent assessments indicate that approximately 414 hospitals and medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed, while 79 ambulances have been attacked, further exacerbating an already overwhelmed healthcare system. As casualties continue to mount, the social challenges faced by Russia become inextricably linked to the growing strain on the military medical infrastructure, highlighting the profound and lasting consequences the conflict will have on both the military and civilian sectors. The Russian military medical system is grappling with significant logistical challenges across all levels of care. With only 10 veterans hospitals nationwide, the system struggles to accommodate the massive influx of wounded soldiers. The situation is particularly dire in psychiatric care, where just 32 beds are available for mental health treatment. The evacuation of wounded soldiers faces persistent delays due to equipment shortages and the ever-present threat of drone attacks, leading to increased mortality rates and exacerbating the medical crisis. This dire situation is compounded by a critical shortage of healthcare workers. Across all treatment levels, medical personnel are in short supply, leading to significant delays in casualty evacuation and an inability to properly address the complex injuries sustained in combat. The system's strain has led to unprecedented incidents, such as a reported rebellion by wounded soldiers in Novosibirsk. Soldiers from the 41st Combined Arms Army refused to return to the front lines, citing inadequate medical care and lack of proper treatment for their injuries. The rehabilitation system, which is already under intense pressure, faces overwhelming demands. Estimates suggest that more than 100,000 veterans will require professional mental health assistance in the coming years. The current infrastructure is woefully inadequate to meet these needs. There are only 10 veterans hospitals across the entire country, and mental health care is limited to a single psychiatric facility with just 32 beds. Furthermore, medical staff are often inadequately trained to handle complex combat injuries, which only adds to the already staggering strain on the system. Recent legal changes have further complicated the situation, criminalizing statements that are seen as discrediting the armed forces. This has created an environment where many troops may be deterred from discussing their trauma, potentially hindering their recovery. Many wounded soldiers are sent to military vacation sanatoriums, which lack proper medical facilities and qualified staff, further impeding their treatment. The crisis has forced medical staff to rapidly adapt, often studying during their off hours to learn how to treat traumatic brain injuries, severe abdominal wounds, and infections. Despite these efforts, the system continues to struggle with the volume of casualties, and there are growing concerns about the long-term sustainability of care and the quality of treatment available to wounded personnel. The healthcare crisis is becoming increasingly unsustainable, with no clear solution in sight to address the immense challenges facing Russia's military medical system. Veteran support challenges. Support systems for wounded Russian soldiers are under increasing pressure as the number of injured veterans continues to rise. With hundreds of thousands of personnel requiring care, the government is facing a significant financial burden in its efforts to support these individuals. In response to this challenge, President Putin recently issued a decree that established a new three-tier compensation structure for injured soldiers. Under this revised system, severely wounded personnel now receive 3 million rubles, USD 30,400, while those with minor injuries are entitled to 1 million rubles, USD 10,100. A third, lower tier provides 100,000 rubles, USD 1,000, for other injuries, marking a substantial reduction from previous flat-rate payments. Military analysts have expressed concerns that this new structure could lead to reduced payouts, as medical authorities may downgrade injury classifications to fit lower tiers. In addition to compensation, the rehabilitation infrastructure is struggling to meet the overwhelming demand from returning veterans. One of the most pressing issues is the severe shortage of psychiatric rehabilitation facilities, with only 32 beds available nationwide. Despite being entitled to 30 days of rehabilitation after demobilization, many veterans face limited access to psychological support services. Furthermore, there is a lack of organized veteran support groups specifically tailored to those who served in the Ukraine conflict, leaving many veterans without the necessary support network for their reintegration. Social reintegration remains another significant obstacle for veterans returning from combat. The absence of comprehensive post-combat support has become a critical issue for the Russian armed forces. Independent veterans organizations have reported that current rehabilitation efforts remain inadequate, particularly in terms of the shortage of psychiatrists, lawyers, and social workers to assist veterans in adjusting to civilian life. To address these challenges, several non-governmental organizations have launched initiatives aimed at supporting veterans. For instance, Dobry Lyudai offers therapy services. A Office of Russia focus on helping veterans transition to civilian life, and the Union of Veterans provides social rehabilitation programs. Despite these efforts, the situation is complicated by widespread post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, with many soldiers suffering from multiple concussions and other psychological traumas. Veterans have expressed concerns that the current system may repeat the mistakes seen after previous conflicts, where thousands of former soldiers struggled without adequate assistance. Recent efforts to improve support for veterans include the establishment of specialized rehabilitation centers offering comprehensive treatment services. One such facility has already provided care to more than 18,000 wounded patients, treating injuries such as mine explosions, burns, and gunshot wounds. However, the demand for these services continues to outpace the available resources, particularly in regions far from major urban centers, leaving many veterans without the care they desperately need. Regional economic effects. At the same time, the extensive military casualties resulting from the ongoing conflict have triggered significant economic restructuring across Russian regions. This has had profound effects on local labor markets and regional development patterns. As the war economy has expanded, it has led to unprecedented wage disparities between the military and civilian sectors, reshaping the traditional economic dynamics across the country. The growing strain on both veteran support systems and regional economies highlights the interconnected challenges Russia faces in addressing both its social and economic upheaval caused by the ongoing conflict. One of the most noticeable disruptions has occurred in Russia's labor market, where industries such as information technology, IT, have been severely impacted. In 2022 alone, the IT sector experienced a 10% workforce exodus, compounded by the departure of major Western tech companies like IBM and Microsoft. This brain drain has created a shortage of more than 500,000 workers in the technology sector, a field that had been a significant driver of Russia's economic growth, contributing nearly a third of the country's expansion since 2015. At the same time, the military sector's competitive wages have distorted the civilian labor market. In some of Russia's poorest regions, military wages now exceed civilian salaries by as much as 5 times. A 35-year-old soldier's family can receive up to 14.5 million rubles in combined salary and death compensation, an amount that surpasses the lifetime earnings of many civilians in these regions. This stark disparity has led to increased economic pressure on local communities, with many citizens seeking military service as a more financially viable option. Regional economic patterns have revealed further contrasts in wealth distribution. For instance, Tuva has seen a 151% increase in bank deposits since the start of the conflict, while Buryatia has experienced an 81% increase. These figures highlight the deepening economic divide as the war economy reshapes the financial landscape in different parts of the country. The industrial sector, particularly military production, has undergone significant expansion. Approximately 6,000 military industrial factories have been established, representing a threefold increase since the invasion. These factories now employ over 3.5 million workers, many of whom work extended shifts, with salary increases ranging from 20% to 60% since the conflict began. This shift has further contributed to the economic displacement, as the demand for labor in the military-industrial complex has become a primary economic driver. In response to these economic shifts, communities in affected regions have adapted by undergoing major transformations. In Buryatia, for example, residential construction has surged by 32%, far outpacing the national average of 2%. Similarly, restaurant and bar revenue in the Altai region has risen by 56%, compared to the national average of just 9%. However, these positive indicators are tempered by broader inflationary pressures, with overall inflation reaching 7.3% in the previous year. Basic commodities, including food, have seen dramatic price increases, such as a 73% rise in potato prices since the start of the year. In response, the central bank raised interest rates to 21% in an attempt to curb inflationary pressures. These shifts have given rise to what economists describe as a war-oriented economy, where military service and employment in the defense industry are now the primary avenues for economic mobility, especially in poorer regions of Russia. Factory workers in these areas now earn monthly salaries ranging from 120,000 to 130,000 rubles, a sharp contrast to pre-war wages of just 15,000 to 20,000 rubles. The profound economic restructuring triggered by the conflict's human toll has thus reshaped the livelihoods of millions, making the war economy a central force in Russia's regional economic landscape. Information control measures. At the same time, the Russian government has implemented stringent information control measures to manage public perception of the conflict and its casualties. These measures aim to shape the narrative around the war, with significant restrictions placed on media coverage, including blocking access to independent news outlets and social media platforms that report on Russian military losses. These actions are part of a broader strategy to maintain control over public discourse, aligning with the growing influence of the war-oriented economy in both social and economic spheres. The intersection of these developments highlights how Russia's economic and information landscapes are both being shaped by the ongoing conflict. The state media regulator, Roskomnadzor, has led these efforts by enforcing strict media controls, with several major outlets forced to cease operations and casualty lists removed from online newspapers following a court ruling that cited potential violations of military secrecy laws. The government's approach to media control is systematic and multifaceted. Social media platforms like Facebook have faced partial blocks, while independent news sites have been completely shut down, and access to foreign media outlets, including BBC operations, has been restricted. These measures are designed to limit public access to information about the war and its human cost. In addition, new legislation imposes severe penalties, including up to 15 years in prison, for spreading false information about military operations. The key restrictions include a ban on terms like war, invasion, and media coverage, mandatory use of official government sources for casualty figures, and criminal penalties for contradicting official military statements. The Russian government has developed a comprehensive system to manage public information about military losses. The last official casualty figure released by Russian authorities was 1,351 in March 2022, even though independent estimates suggest much higher numbers. Casualty data is now classified as a state secret, and the media are restricted to publishing only government-approved figures. This has led to a significant information vacuum within Russia, as domestic media are unable to report on the true scale of military losses, while international observers estimate that Russian casualties have reached 600,000, including both killed and wounded. The impact of these information control measures extends beyond traditional media, with independent journalists and social media users also targeted. Roskomnadzor has issued warnings to multiple independent media outlets for publishing what it calls false information about the conflict, with non-compliance potentially resulting in fines of up to 5 million rubles. The intensification of these measures reflects the growing efforts of the Russian government to maintain control over the narrative surrounding the war, including the monitoring of social media posts, restricting access to VPN services, and enforcing the use of specific terminology when discussing military operations. These restrictions have created significant challenges for accurate casualty reporting and further deepened the divide between domestic and international perspectives on the true cost of the conflict. International aid response. The international community has mobilized significant resources to address the growing humanitarian crisis resulting from the extensive Russian casualties in Ukraine. Leading the humanitarian response, the United States has committed $2.6 billion in aid, focusing on emergency medical assistance and essential support services for those affected by the conflict. This support is critical as the scale of casualties continues to rise, overwhelming local systems. Medical assistance has become a central component of this humanitarian effort, particularly in providing treatment to wounded soldiers. The quality of medical care has varied, with some foreign troops receiving preferential treatment in larger hospitals located in cities like Kursk, while smaller village hospitals struggle to manage the influx of casualties. The international medical response includes emergency care in frontline zones, mental health support for affected regions, rehabilitation services in specialized facilities, and the provision of critical medical equipment to hospitals and care units. The United Nations has coordinated a comprehensive humanitarian response, reaching 6.2 million people in 2024 with essential assistance. This aid package includes emergency food, shelter, access to safe drinking water, essential household items, and psychosocial support services to help affected populations cope with the trauma. Despite these efforts, the Ukraine humanitarian needs and response plan remains underfunded, with only half of the necessary resources secured. An estimated 14.6 million people, or 40% of Ukraine's population, are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. In response, USAID has allocated more than $451 million for regional needs, highlighting the ongoing efforts to address the crisis. International cooperation, however, faces significant challenges. In 2023 alone, there were 225 incidents that directly impacted humanitarian operations. Systematic denial of access and security concerns have complicated efforts to verify the full scale of the crisis and deliver aid to the most affected regions. Key international organizations coordinating the response include the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF. The European Union has activated its civil protection mechanism in response to Ukraine's formal request for humanitarian support. This coordinated effort aims to streamline the delivery of medical supplies and equipment across borders, but access restrictions and ongoing security concerns have hindered its full implementation. Meanwhile, USAID has set up a disaster assistance response team in Poland to help manage the international response, working closely with partner organizations. However, non-governmental organizations report difficulties operating in Russian-controlled territories, limiting their ability to provide assistance where it is most needed. In the face of these obstacles, the international community continues to stress the importance of protecting civilian infrastructure and ensuring uninterrupted humanitarian access. Multiple UN member states have called for enhanced protection of humanitarian operations, though the delivery of aid remains complicated by the ongoing conflict and security challenges. Despite the significant mobilization of resources, the humanitarian response is far from meeting the full scope of needs, and continued efforts are required to alleviate the suffering of millions. The scale of Russian military casualties in Ukraine, exceeding 600,000 personnel, has forced a major reassessment of Moscow's military capabilities and strategic priorities. With significant losses in ongoing combat operations, the Russian military faces serious challenges in maintaining its effectiveness and addressing critical weaknesses in force structure, equipment, training, and command. Simplified production processes and limited innovation are contributing to a decline in combat readiness and operational flexibility, and these issues will likely persist until hostilities cease. In response to the growing casualties, Russia has implemented social policy changes, including a new compensation system offering tiered payments for different levels of injury and death, with substantial financial support for veterans. However, the rapid implementation of these policies highlights the immense financial burden, with veteran support costs reaching approximately 2.3 trillion rubles, or 6% of Russia's annual budget. Strategically, the conflict has prompted a re-evaluation of Russia's military objectives, with projections suggesting that equipment attrition will severely impact combat power after 2026. The defense industry is struggling with technological limitations due to international sanctions, and there is growing reliance on simplified manufacturing processes and foreign suppliers like China, Iran, and North Korea. Despite a planned $160 billion increase in defense spending, experts warn that these investments may not improve force quality, particularly as recruitment standards continue to decline. The long-term financial impact of the war is also significant, with estimates suggesting that approximately 500,000 veterans may develop post-traumatic stress disorder, requiring substantial annual expenditure. The strategic outlook indicates that Russia's military is likely to prioritize mass over maneuver, reflecting both immediate operational demands and the constraints imposed by ongoing losses. While the military seeks to maintain pressure on the front lines, The ability to regenerate its capabilities while sustaining operations remains uncertain, with continued Western support for Ukraine being a key factor in determining Russia's military future.